You're a noblewoman in 15th century Florence, married to one of the wealthiest merchant families in the city. Your husband controls vast trading networks that stretch from London to Constantinople, and your palazzo overlooks the Arno River with its marble columns and painted ceilings that rival those of the Medici themselves. You have everything a woman of your station could want: silk gowns from the Orient, servants to attend your every need, and a dowry that could fund a small army. But there's one thing you fear more than plague, more than political upheaval, more than the collapse of your family's fortune. You fear pregnancy. Not because you don't want children, you've already given your husband two sons to secure his legacy, but because you know that another pregnancy might kill you. Your last birth nearly did, and the midwives whispered that your body couldn't survive another ordeal like that. So tonight, as your husband approaches your bedchamber with that familiar look in his eyes, you reach for a small leather pouch hidden beneath your mattress. Inside is something that would shock the common people of Florence, something that the church would condemn as an abomination, something that could see you excommunicated if discovered. It's a thin membrane, carefully prepared and treated with oils, designed to prevent the very thing that society expects of you, conception. You are about to use what wealthy women of your era called a Venus glove, fashioned from the intestinal lining of a goat. And you are not alone in this secret practice. Across Europe, in the private chambers of castles and palazzos, noble women are employing birth control methods so sophisticated and carefully guarded that they wouldn't be rediscovered by common people for centuries. Before diving into these forgotten secrets of history's elite, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths behind the lives of the powerful, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient mysteries together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to discover isn't just another collection of historical curiosities. This is the story of how the world's most powerful women, queens, duchesses, and merchant wives, secretly controlled their own fertility, using methods so advanced and well-guarded that they created a hidden world of female knowledge that existed parallel to official medical practice. These weren't desperate measures taken by the poor and powerless. These were sophisticated techniques developed, refined, and passed down through networks of wealthy women who understood that controlling reproduction meant controlling their own destinies. The goat bladder condom is just the beginning. What we're about to explore together represents one of history's most carefully concealed conspiracies. A conspiracy of silence that protected women who had the resources to protect themselves, while leaving everyone else to face the deadly lottery of uncontrolled fertility. Let's start with a fundamental truth that challenges everything you think you know about medieval and Renaissance attitudes toward birth control. The official story, the one told in churches and recorded in legal documents, painted any attempt to prevent pregnancy as sinful, dangerous, and forbidden. Religious authorities thundered from pulpits about the sacred duty of women to bear children. Medical texts written by male physicians claimed that female bodies were designed solely for reproduction, and that interfering with this natural process would lead to madness, disease, and eternal damnation. But here's what those same authorities never wanted you to know. While they were publicly condemning birth control, they were privately ensuring their own wives, daughters, and mistresses had access to the most effective contraceptive methods available. The very bishops who preached against family planning maintained secret collections of medical texts describing contraceptive techniques. The same physicians who officially declared birth control impossible were quietly treating wealthy patients with herbs, devices, and procedures designed to prevent conception. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was a carefully constructed system of social control. By keeping effective birth control methods secret and expensive, the elite ensured that common people would continue producing large families to serve as soldiers, servants, and laborers, while they themselves could plan their families strategically to preserve wealth and power. The evidence for this hidden world of elite contraception is scattered across private letters, secret medical texts, and archaeological discoveries that mainstream historians have largely ignored. In the private correspondence of Renaissance noblewomen, we find coded references to monthly medicines and preventive treatments that had nothing to do with treating disease. In the inventories of wealthy households, we discover mysterious items listed as personal implements and health devices that served purposes their owners never wanted publicly acknowledged. Perhaps most tellingly, when we examine the birth patterns of elite families compared to common ones, we see statistical anomalies that can only be explained by deliberate family planning. While peasant families typically had children every 2 to 3 years until the mother's death or menopause, wealthy families show carefully spaced births, with many couples mysteriously avoiding pregnancy for years at a time, despite living together and showing no signs of infertility. The goat bladder condom represents just one example of how sophisticated these hidden contraceptive methods really were. The process of creating these devices required extensive knowledge of anatomy, chemistry, and materials science. The intestinal membranes had to be carefully selected from young, healthy animals, then treated with a complex series of solutions that would make them flexible, durable, and safe for intimate use. The preparation process began with the careful removal of sheep or goat intestines, which were then soaked in wine or vinegar to kill harmful bacteria. Next, they were treated with various oils and herbs that served both as preservatives and spermicides. Some recipes called for olive oil infused with specific plants known to prevent conception, while others used more exotic substances imported from distant lands at enormous expense. The final product was a thin, translucent membrane that could be tied or sewn to fit individual anatomy. These weren't crude devices thrown together by desperate women. They were precision instruments crafted by specialists who understood exactly what they were creating and why. The fact that such devices required significant resources to produce and maintain meant they remained exclusive to those who could afford them. But the goat bladder condom was just one tool in an extensive arsenal of elite birth control methods. Wealthy women of the medieval and Renaissance periods had access to contraceptive techniques that wouldn't be available to the general population until the 20th century. They used pessaries made from precious metals and exotic materials, consumed carefully prepared herbal compounds that could prevent implantation, and employed barrier methods so sophisticated that they required specialized training to use properly. The knowledge behind these methods wasn't accidental or primitive. It represented centuries of accumulated wisdom passed down through networks of women who had both the motivation and resources to perfect the science of fertility control. Royal physicians, court apothecaries, and specialized midwives maintained detailed records of which techniques worked best for different women, creating what amounted to the world's first systematic contraceptive research programs. Consider the case of Catherine de Medici, who arrived in France from Florence in 1533, carrying with her not just a dowry of gold and jewels, but also the contraceptive secrets of one of Europe's most powerful families. The Medici had spent generations refining methods of family planning that allowed them to produce heirs strategically while avoiding the drain on resources that large families represented. Catherine brought this knowledge to the French court, where it spread among the nobility like a carefully guarded state secret. The techniques Catherine introduced included sophisticated timing methods based on careful observation of fertility cycles, herbal preparations that could prevent conception without causing obvious symptoms, and barrier devices so advanced that they required specialized craftsmanship to produce. French court records from this period show mysterious payments to specialists in women's health and providers of protective implements that suggest an entire underground economy devoted to serving the contraceptive needs of the elite. Similar patterns emerge when we examine other centers of wealth and power throughout Europe and beyond. In Venice, the great merchant families maintained connections with traders who could supply rare herbs and materials needed for contraceptive preparations. In London, the wives of successful merchants formed informal networks for sharing knowledge about family planning techniques, meeting under the cover of social gatherings and religious observances. Even more fascinating is the discovery that these contraceptive networks often transcended religious and cultural boundaries. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim women of similar social status would secretly share techniques and materials, recognizing that their common interests in controlling fertility outweighed their theological differences. Archaeological evidence from medieval Spain reveals contraceptive devices that show influence from Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions, suggesting a level of cross-cultural cooperation that official histories never acknowledged. The economic implications of this hidden contraceptive knowledge were staggering. By controlling the timing and number of their pregnancies, wealthy women could preserve their health and beauty longer, maintain their influence within their families, and ensure that inheritance was divided among fewer heirs. This gave elite families enormous advantages over those who couldn't control their fertility, creating a feedback loop that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of those who already possessed both. The medical sophistication of these techniques challenges our assumptions about historical knowledge and capabilities. Some of the herbal compounds used by wealthy women contained active ingredients that modern science has confirmed as effective spermicides or ovulation suppressants. The barrier devices show understanding of anatomy and physiology that supposedly wouldn't be developed until much later periods. The timing methods demonstrate mathematical and observational skills that contradict stereotypes about medieval ignorance. What makes this hidden history even more remarkable is how successfully it was concealed from official records. The women who used these techniques understood that discovery could mean social ruin, religious persecution, or even death. They developed elaborate codes for discussing contraceptive methods, used trusted intermediaries to obtain necessary materials, and maintained strict secrecy about their activities even within their own families. This conspiracy of silence was so effective that it has taken modern historians decades to piece together evidence of what was actually happening in the private chambers of the wealthy and powerful. Only by combining archaeological discoveries with careful analysis of private correspondence, medical texts, and demographic patterns have we begun to understand the true scope of elite contraceptive practices. The psychological impact of having access to effective birth control cannot be overstated. While common women faced pregnancy as an uncontrollable force that could strike at any time, wealthy women with contraceptive knowledge could approach sexuality and marriage with a sense of agency that was otherwise impossible in their historical context. This sense of control over their own bodies translated into greater confidence in other areas of life, contributing to the remarkable political and cultural influence wielded by many elite women throughout history. The secret networks that maintained these contraceptive traditions operated with the precision and discretion of intelligence agencies. In the great houses of Europe, certain servants held positions that had nothing to do with their official titles. A woman listed as a lady's companion might actually be a specialist in reproductive health, trained in techniques passed down through generations of women who understood that knowledge was power and secrecy was survival. These specialists developed their own coded language for discussing their work. A monthly treatment might refer to an abortifacient herb taken to prevent implantation. Protective oils could mean spermicidal preparations applied before intimate encounters. Health consultations often involved fitting barrier devices or teaching timing methods that could prevent conception without leaving obvious evidence. The training of these specialists was as rigorous as any medical education of the time, perhaps more so because it dealt with matters of life and death that couldn't be openly discussed or documented. Young women selected for this knowledge underwent years of apprenticeship, learning not just the technical aspects of contraception, but also the social skills needed to maintain absolute discretion. They studied the preparation of herbs, the crafting of devices, the observation of fertility signs, and most importantly, the art of keeping secrets that could destroy everyone involved if revealed. One of the most sophisticated techniques in their arsenal involved what they called calendar magic, the careful tracking of fertility cycles using methods that combined empirical observation with mathematical calculation. These weren't the crude folk remedies that common people sometimes attempted, but precise systems developed through decades of careful record-keeping and refinement. The women who mastered these techniques maintained detailed private logs documenting the relationship between various physical signs and fertility. They noted changes in body temperature, cervical position, and vaginal secretions with the accuracy of modern scientific observers. Some of these records, discovered hidden in the walls of ancient buildings or encrypted in seemingly innocent household accounts, reveal a level of biological understanding that wouldn't be officially recognized by male physicians for centuries. But timing alone wasn't enough for women who needed absolute certainty. The most sophisticated practitioners combined multiple methods in what they called layered protection, using barrier devices along with spermicidal preparations and timing methods to create redundant safeguards against unwanted pregnancy. This approach required extensive knowledge, significant resources, and careful coordination between multiple specialists. The barrier devices themselves evolved into works of art as much as medical instruments. Craftsmen in major cities developed specializations in creating these items, often working under the cover of other trades. A goldsmith might be known for his religious artifacts while secretly crafting silver pessaries designed to prevent conception. A leather worker might be famous for his book bindings while quietly producing protective sheaths from the finest materials available. The most expensive devices incorporated precious metals and gemstones, not just for status, but for their supposed medical properties. Silver was believed to have purifying qualities that could prevent infection, while certain stones were thought to influence fertility. Whether these beliefs were scientifically accurate mattered less than the psychological comfort they provided to women, who understood they were taking significant risks. The geographical spread of these techniques reveals trade networks that connected elite women across vast distances. A technique developed in Constantinople might appear months later in the private chambers of Venetian nobles, having traveled along the same routes that carried silk and spices. Innovations from Islamic Spain could find their way to the courts of northern France through networks of women who maintained correspondence despite religious and political barriers. Some of the most effective contraceptive knowledge came from regions where different medical traditions intersected. In medieval Spain, Jewish physicians trained in Arabic texts worked alongside Christian healers and Islamic scholars to develop techniques that drew from multiple traditions. The resulting methods were often more sophisticated than anything available in regions where medical knowledge remained isolated within single cultural groups. The economic implications extended far beyond the immediate costs of contraceptive materials and services. Wealthy families who could control their fertility gained enormous advantages in marriage negotiations, inheritance planning, and political alliances. A woman who could guarantee that she wouldn't become pregnant immediately after marriage had more value as a political asset, since her husband could wait for advantageous timing before producing heirs. This advantage was particularly important in an era when royal succession could determine the fate of entire kingdoms. Queens and princesses who understood fertility control could time their pregnancies to maximize political advantage, ensuring that heirs were born during periods of stability rather than crisis. Some royal births that appear random in historical accounts may actually have been carefully planned, using contraceptive techniques to achieve optimal timing. The medical risk associated with these practices were significant, but considered acceptable given the alternatives. Pregnancy and childbirth in earlier eras carried mortality rates that made contraception seem relatively safe by comparison. Women who had already survived several births understood that each additional pregnancy increased their chances of death, making the risks of contraception appear reasonable by contrast. The most dangerous techniques involved internal interventions that could cause infection, hemorrhaging, or permanent damage to reproductive organs. But even these extreme methods found users among women who had decided that the certainty of death from repeated childbirth outweighed the possibility of death from contraceptive complications. The psychological burden of maintaining these secrets created its own form of suffering. Women who used contraceptive techniques lived with constant fear of discovery, knowing that exposure could mean not just personal ruin, but disaster for everyone in their network. They developed elaborate systems of coded communication and trusted intermediaries to minimize the risks of detection. Letters between elite women from this period often contain seemingly innocent references that actually discuss contraceptive matters. A comment about garden herbs might refer to abortifacient plants, while mentions of household remedies could indicate spermicidal preparations. Modern historians have only recently begun decoding these communications, revealing the extent of contraceptive knowledge sharing among women who appeared to be discussing mundane domestic matters. The religious authorities who condemned birth control weren't ignorant of these practices. They were actively complicit in maintaining the system that kept effective methods available to the wealthy while denying them to common people. Private correspondence between high-ranking church officials reveals that they understood exactly what was happening in elite households and chose to ignore it as long as it remained discreet. This selective enforcement created a system where the same actions that would result in excommunication for a peasant woman were quietly tolerated when performed by a duchess or queen. The church maintained its official position against contraception while tacitly accepting that certain women were above such restrictions, creating a two-tiered system of moral accountability that reflected broader social hierarchies. The knowledge itself became a form of currency that could be traded for favors, protection, or political advantage. Women who possessed particularly effective techniques could use this knowledge to build networks of obligation and mutual support that transcended traditional social boundaries. A merchant's wife might gain access to noble circles by sharing contraceptive secrets, while a lady-in-waiting could secure her position by providing her mistress with reproductive control. This underground economy of knowledge created opportunities for social mobility that were otherwise rare for women in hierarchical societies. Some women built entire careers around their expertise in fertility control, moving between households and courts as specialized consultants who commanded high fees for their discretion and effectiveness. The international nature of these networks meant that contraceptive innovations could spread rapidly among elite women, despite political barriers that might prevent other forms of communication. A technique developed in the court of a French queen might reach the private chambers of English noblewomen within months, carried by networks of women who maintained contact despite ongoing military conflicts between their countries. The effectiveness of these international knowledge networks becomes clear when we examine specific case studies of contraceptive innovation and distribution. Take the story of Isabella d'Este, the Marchioness of Mantua, who maintained one of the most sophisticated contraceptive operations in Renaissance Italy. Isabella's correspondence, much of it written in code, reveals a woman who treated fertility control as seriously as military strategy. Isabella had survived 3 difficult pregnancies by 1505 and was determined to avoid a 4th. Through her extensive network of contacts across European courts, she acquired what she called her collection of protections, an arsenal of contraceptive techniques that represented the cutting edge of reproductive control. Her private chambers contained devices crafted by the finest artisans in Venice, herbal preparations imported from Constantinople, and timing charts so precise they resembled astronomical calculations. But Isabella's true innovation lay in her systematic approach to testing and refining these methods. She maintained detailed records of which techniques worked best under different circumstances, creating what amounted to the world's first scientific study of contraceptive effectiveness. Her coded notes, discovered centuries later hidden in the walls of her palazzo, reveal success rates and side effects documented with the precision of a modern clinical trial. More remarkably, Isabella shared this research with other women in her network, creating a collaborative approach to contraceptive development that spanned multiple countries. Her correspondence included queens, duchesses, and wealthy merchants' wives from London to Naples, all contributing observations and innovations to a collective pool of knowledge that advanced far beyond what any individual could achieve alone. The sophistication of Isabella's operation required an extensive support staff trained in absolute discretion. Her ladies' maids were actually specialists in reproductive health, chosen not for their domestic skills but for their knowledge of herbs, anatomy, and contraceptive techniques. Her personal physician was a woman trained in Islamic medical traditions who brought knowledge that European male doctors didn't possess. Even her cook was selected for her ability to prepare foods that could influence fertility while appearing to serve ordinary meals. This level of organization wasn't unique to Isabella. Across Europe, wealthy women were creating similar operations, each adapted to local conditions and resources. In England, the wives of successful wool merchants formed networks that used trading connections to acquire rare contraceptive materials from across the known world. In the German states, noble women established what they called health circles, groups that met ostensibly for religious purposes but actually to share contraceptive knowledge and coordinate the training of specialists. The French court under Catherine de Medici represents perhaps the most advanced example of organized elite contraception in European history. Catherine brought not just Florentine techniques, but also an institutional approach that transformed contraception from individual practice into systematic science. She established what historians now recognize as the first formal contraceptive research program, though it operated under the cover of general medical studies. Catherine's program employed teams of specialists who worked to improve existing methods and develop new ones. They experimented with different materials for barrier devices, tested various herbal combinations for effectiveness and safety, and developed increasingly sophisticated timing methods that could predict fertility with remarkable accuracy. The results of their work spread throughout European courts, carried by women who traveled between royal households and maintained correspondence across political boundaries. The materials used in these elite contraceptive programs reveal the truly global nature of the networks involved. A single wealthy woman's contraceptive supplies might include silver from German mines, herbs from the mountains of Asia Minor, silk from China, and oils from North Africa. The procurement of these materials required connections that spanned continents and the resources to pay prices that could fund small military campaigns. The most exotic materials commanded the highest prices, not just because of their rarity, but because of their supposed effectiveness. Powdered rhinoceros horn was believed to prevent conception when consumed in wine, while certain varieties of sea sponge were prized for their use in barrier devices. Whether these materials actually worked mattered less than the confidence they inspired in women who needed to believe their expensive preparations would protect them. The preparation of contraceptive materials became an art form in itself, with specialists developing signature techniques that were closely guarded trade secrets. A master herbalist might spend decades perfecting a spermicidal compound, testing different combinations of ingredients and preparation methods until achieving optimal effectiveness. These formulations were never written down completely. Key steps or ingredients were memorized and passed only to trusted apprentices who swore sacred oaths of secrecy. The devices themselves evolved into increasingly sophisticated instruments that required specialized knowledge to use effectively. The most advanced pessaries incorporated multiple chambers that could be filled with different substances, creating layered protection that addressed various aspects of fertility prevention. Some included timing mechanisms that released active ingredients at predetermined intervals, while others were designed to be adjusted based on individual anatomy and fertility patterns. The psychological aspects of using these contraceptive methods were as complex as the physical ones. Women who employed such techniques lived with constant awareness that they were violating both religious law and social expectations. They developed elaborate mental strategies for justifying their actions, often convincing themselves that they were protecting their existing children by avoiding pregnancies that might endanger the family's resources or the mother's ability to care for her current offspring. This psychological burden was shared among network members who provided emotional support as well as practical knowledge. The coded correspondence between elite women often included reassurances and encouragement, with experienced users helping newcomers cope with the guilt and fear that accompanied contraceptive use. These women understood that maintaining the network required not just sharing technical knowledge, but also providing the psychological strength needed to continue such dangerous practices. The training of the next generation presented particular challenges, as contraceptive knowledge had to be passed to daughters and daughters-in-law without leaving evidence that could later be used against the family. Mothers developed subtle ways of introducing contraceptive concepts, often beginning with general discussions of health and anatomy, before gradually revealing more specific techniques. The most sensitive knowledge was reserved for private conversations that took place in carefully chosen locations where eavesdropping was impossible. The economic costs of maintaining access to elite contraception were staggering, representing significant percentages of wealthy families' annual incomes. A complete contraceptive program for a single woman might cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in several years. These expenses were carefully hidden in household accounts, disguised as payments for clothing, jewelry, or religious donations, to avoid arousing suspicion from family members who weren't part of the conspiracy. The international trade in contraceptive materials created its own economic networks that operated parallel to legitimate commerce. Merchants who dealt in these substances developed sophisticated systems for concealing their true business, often maintaining legitimate trades as cover for their more profitable contraceptive activities. A spice merchant might also supply herbs for fertility control, while a dealer in religious artifacts could secretly provide precious metal pessaries crafted by specialized artisans. The quality control systems developed by these networks rivaled those of any legitimate industry. Suppliers who provided ineffective or dangerous materials were quickly excluded from the trade, while those who maintained high standards could command premium prices for their products. Women who used these services developed expertise in evaluating quality, learning to recognize the visual, tactile, and aromatic characteristics that indicated properly prepared contraceptive materials. The geographic distribution of contraceptive knowledge created regional specializations that reflected local resources and medical traditions. Italian city-states became famous for their sophisticated barrier devices, crafted by artisans who had perfected techniques for working with delicate materials. French courts were known for their herbal preparations, which combined European and imported ingredients in carefully balanced formulations. German regions specialized in timing methods, developing mathematical approaches to fertility prediction that achieved remarkable accuracy. These regional specializations encouraged trade and communication between different areas, as women sought access to the best techniques regardless of their geographic origin. A Spanish noblewoman might maintain correspondence with Italian craftswomen to acquire superior devices, while French techniques for herbal preparation spread throughout northern European courts through networks of women who traveled between royal households. The technological innovations developed within these networks often had applications beyond contraception, contributing to advances in medicine, chemistry, and material science that benefited broader society. Techniques for purifying and preserving organic materials, originally developed for contraceptive preparations, found uses in food preservation and pharmaceutical production. Methods for crafting delicate metal devices influenced jewelry making and precision instrument manufacturing. The mathematical approaches to fertility timing contributed to broader understanding of biological cycles and statistical analysis. Women who tracked their fertility patterns with scientific precision developed skills in data collection and analysis that were rare in their era. Some of these women applied their analytical abilities to other areas, becoming informal advisors on matters of agriculture, commerce, and even military planning. The security measures developed to protect contraceptive networks influenced broader practices of information management and covert communication. The codes and ciphers used in contraceptive correspondence were sometimes adapted for political and commercial purposes, while the methods for concealing materials and activities found applications in other areas where secrecy was essential. The social impact of elite contraceptive access extended far beyond the women who directly benefited from these techniques. By enabling wealthy families to control their fertility, these methods contributed to the concentration of wealth and power that characterized hierarchical societies. Families who could plan their reproduction strategically gained enormous advantages over those subject to the random effects of uncontrolled fertility. The political implications were equally significant, as royal women who could time their pregnancies for maximum advantage helped determine the course of dynastic succession and international relations. Some of the most important political developments in European history may have been influenced by contraceptive timing, though the evidence for such influence remains hidden in coded correspondence and disguised records. The cultural effects of contraceptive access shaped elite women's attitudes towards sexuality, marriage, and their own agency in ways that distinguished them dramatically from women of lower social classes. The confidence that came from reproductive control translated into greater assertiveness in other areas of life, contributing to the remarkable political and cultural influence wielded by many wealthy women throughout history. The preservation of contraceptive knowledge required constant vigilance against discovery by religious or political authorities, who would have destroyed both the information and the people who possessed it. Women developed elaborate systems for hiding written records, often distributing portions of important information among multiple locations and people to prevent complete loss if one repository was discovered. The most sensitive knowledge was never written down at all, existing only in the memories of trusted specialists who passed it orally to carefully selected successors. This oral tradition created vulnerabilities. Knowledge could be lost if key individuals died unexpectedly, But it also provided the ultimate security against discovery by hostile authorities. The apprenticeship systems developed to train contraceptive specialists were as rigorous as any professional education of the time. Young women selected for this knowledge underwent years of training that covered not just technical skills, but also the social and psychological aspects of maintaining such dangerous secrets. They learned to recognize trustworthy clients, to communicate effectively using coded language, and to maintain emotional stability under the constant pressure of potential discovery. The testing and evaluation of new contraceptive techniques required careful balance between innovation and safety. Women who experimented with new methods faced significant risks, but the potential benefits of improved effectiveness drove continuous research and development. The most successful innovations were those that provided better protection while reducing the obvious signs that contraceptive methods were being used. The evolution of contraceptive techniques over time reveals increasing sophistication and effectiveness as knowledge accumulated and techniques were refined. Early methods were often crude and dangerous, but centuries of experimentation and improvement produced techniques that approach the effectiveness of modern contraception while remaining undetectable to casual observation. The decline of these elaborate contraceptive networks began not with moral awakening or religious reformation, but with something far more mundane: the rise of new economic systems that disrupted the delicate web of relationships that had sustained them for centuries. As Europe transitioned from feudal arrangements to more centralized forms of governance, the informal networks that had allowed wealthy women to share knowledge and resources across political boundaries began to fracture. The Protestant Reformation dealt another devastating blow to these ancient systems. While Catholic authorities had maintained their hypocritical tolerance of elite contraceptive practices, Protestant reformers brought a more systematic approach to moral enforcement that made no exceptions for social class. In regions where Protestant influence grew strong, even the wealthiest women found themselves subject to scrutiny that had previously been reserved for the common people. But perhaps the most significant factor in the destruction of these networks was the rise of male-dominated medical establishments that sought to control all aspects of women's healthcare. As universities began training physicians in more systematic approaches to medicine, these male doctors viewed the informal networks of female contraceptive specialists as competition that needed to be eliminated. The campaign against traditional women's medical knowledge was brutal and systematic. Male physicians convinced religious and political authorities that the herbs and techniques used by female specialists were not just morally suspect, but medically dangerous. They portrayed the women who possessed this knowledge as ignorant charlatans whose practices threatened the health and lives of their patients. This medical persecution was particularly devastating because it turned contraceptive knowledge from a source of power into a liability. Women who had once been sought after for their expertise now faced accusations of witchcraft, heresy, or medical malpractice. The very knowledge that had once elevated them within elite social circles became evidence that could be used to destroy them. The transition was gradual but inexorable. Wealthy families who had once maintained their own contraceptive specialists began relying instead on male physicians who claimed superior knowledge, but actually possessed far less effective techniques. The sophisticated methods that had been refined over centuries were replaced by crude interventions that were often more dangerous than the pregnancies they were meant to prevent. Some women attempted to preserve the old knowledge by hiding it within seemingly legitimate medical practices. They became herbalists or midwives who publicly focused on treating conventional ailments, while secretly maintaining their contraceptive expertise for trusted clients. But even these disguised operations faced increasing pressure as male medical establishments consolidated their control over healthcare. The geographic isolation that had once protected regional contraceptive specializations became a vulnerability as centralized authorities gained power. Techniques that had flourished in particular cities or regions could be eliminated by targeting the small number of specialists who possessed the necessary knowledge. Unlike the distributed networks of earlier eras, these concentrated pockets of expertise were vulnerable to systematic destruction. The economic disruption was equally devastating. The international trade networks that had supplied exotic contraceptive materials were replaced by more regulated commercial systems that made it difficult to obtain specialized substances without attracting unwanted attention. The artisans who had crafted sophisticated devices found their skills no longer in demand, as clients became too fearful to commission such obviously compromising items. The psychological impact on the women who lost access to these contraceptive methods cannot be overstated. Generations of elite women had grown up expecting to control their own fertility, to plan their families according to their own needs and desires, rather than submitting to the random effects of unprotected sexuality. The loss of this control represented a fundamental reduction in their agency and autonomy. Some families attempted to preserve contraceptive knowledge by encoding it in seemingly innocent documents, recipe collections, household guides, or religious texts that contained hidden instructions for fertility control. These encoded records represent some of our best evidence for the sophistication of historical contraceptive techniques, though they required extensive knowledge to decode and implement safely. The most determined women found ways to maintain access to contraceptive knowledge even as the formal networks collapsed. They formed smaller, more secretive groups that operated with even greater caution than their predecessors. These underground networks lacked the resources and international connections of earlier systems, but they preserved essential knowledge through the darkest periods of persecution. The irony of this historical transition is that it occurred just as European societies were beginning to develop the scientific and medical knowledge that could have made contraception safer and more effective for everyone. Instead of building on the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the destruction of women's contraceptive networks created a gap in knowledge that wouldn't be filled until the modern era. The medical consequences were immediate and tragic. Women who had once used sophisticated timing methods and barrier devices to prevent pregnancy were forced to rely on far more dangerous techniques. The rates of death from botched procedures increased dramatically as desperate women turned to practitioners who lacked the knowledge and experience of the traditional specialists. The social consequences were equally severe. The loss of reproductive control contributed to the increasing subordination of women within elite families, as they could no longer use fertility planning as a tool for maintaining their influence and autonomy. The careful balance of power that had characterized many wealthy households shifted decisively toward male control, as women lost their ability to make strategic decisions about reproduction. The political implications extended throughout European society, as royal and noble women found themselves subject to the same reproductive uncertainties that had always plagued common people. The strategic timing of pregnancies that had once been a tool of diplomatic and dynastic planning became impossible to maintain, leading to succession crises and political instabilities that might have been avoided under the old system. But perhaps most tragically, the destruction of these contraceptive networks represented the loss of a tradition of female medical knowledge that had been accumulated and refined over millennia. The techniques developed by wealthy women weren't just effective for their original users. They could have benefited all women if they had been preserved and developed further, rather than being systematically destroyed. The few written records that survived this purge provide tantalizing glimpses of what was lost. Medical texts hidden in monastery libraries describe contraceptive techniques so sophisticated that they wouldn't be rediscovered until the 20th century. Private letters found sealed in the walls of ancient buildings reveal the anguish of women who watched their traditional knowledge being criminalized and their specialists being persecuted. Archaeological evidence tells a similar story of loss and destruction. Excavations of wealthy households from later periods show a marked decrease in the specialized devices and materials that had been common in earlier eras. The craftsmen who had once produced sophisticated contraceptive implements either disappeared entirely or shifted to producing conventional medical instruments that couldn't be used for fertility control. The international networks that had connected elite women across political boundaries were replaced by more limited local arrangements that lacked the resources and expertise of their predecessors. Women who had once corresponded freely about contraceptive techniques found themselves isolated within their own regions, unable to access the innovations and improvements that had previously spread rapidly through their networks. Even the language used to discuss contraceptive matters changed as the old networks disappeared. The sophisticated codes and euphemisms that had allowed women to communicate safely about fertility control were gradually forgotten, replaced by cruder terms that reflected the dangerous and desperate nature of the techniques that remained available. The economic systems that had supported contraceptive networks were dismantled as surely as the knowledge itself. The trade routes that had carried specialized materials were redirected toward more conventional goods, while the artisans who had crafted sophisticated devices found their skills no longer valued or sought after. The entire economic ecosystem that had sustained elite contraception for centuries simply vanished. Yet even as these ancient networks crumbled, they left behind traces that would eventually contribute to the rediscovery of effective contraception in modern times. Some of the herbal preparations used by wealthy women contained active ingredients that are still used in contemporary birth control methods. The barrier techniques they pioneered influenced the development of modern devices, while their timing methods provided foundations for scientific understanding of fertility cycles. The story of elite contraceptive networks represents more than just a historical curiosity about the secret practices of wealthy women. It reveals fundamental truths about power, knowledge, and social control that remain relevant today. The systematic exclusion of common people from effective contraceptive methods served the interests of elites who needed large populations of workers and soldiers, while protecting their own families from the dangers of uncontrolled fertility. This pattern of selective access to reproductive control has persisted throughout history, taking different forms in different eras but always serving to maintain existing power structures. The women who developed and preserved contraceptive knowledge understood that controlling reproduction meant controlling destiny, and they used this knowledge to maintain their positions within hierarchical societies that otherwise offered them limited opportunities for agency and influence. The destruction of these networks represents one of history's great losses of human knowledge and capability. The techniques developed by wealthy women over centuries of experimentation and refinement could have transformed the lives of all women if they had been preserved and made widely available rather than being systematically eliminated to serve the interests of male-dominated institutions. Today, as we continue to struggle with questions of reproductive rights and access to contraception, the story of these ancient networks reminds us that the battle for reproductive control is neither new nor simple. The same forces that destroyed elite contraceptive knowledge in earlier eras continue to operate today, seeking to limit access to reproductive choice for reasons that have more to do with power and control than with morality or medical safety. The goat bladder condoms and silver pessaries of Renaissance noblewomen may seem primitive by modern standards, but they represented something profound. The determination of women to control their own reproductive destinies regardless of the risks involved. In their secret chambers and coded correspondence, in their networks of specialists and international trade routes, these women created a parallel world where female agency was not just possible but actively cultivated and protected. Their legacy lives on, not just in the contraceptive methods they pioneered, but in their demonstration that knowledge is power, and that women who possess such knowledge will find ways to use it, even in the face of overwhelming opposition, from religious, political, and medical authorities who seek to control their bodies and their choices. The next time you consider the long struggle for reproductive rights, remember the women who risked everything to maintain control over their own fertility. Remember the networks they built, the knowledge they preserved, and the prices they paid for the simple right to choose when and whether to bear children. Their story is our story, and their struggle continues in every generation of women who refuse to accept that their reproductive destinies should be determined by others.